The Falcons Audible continues, presented by AT&T. Your guys are back in the studio here. They call it the podcast studio. They got the on-air light, so hopefully nobody walks in the door in the middle of this production, although I think it's lunch break right now, if I remember correctly.
Very quiet here.
Yeah, everything's kind of quiet right
Except
now.
for the eating that's going on below us.
Yeah, there's a lot of what we would call getting down going down in the cafeteria right now. I'm Derek Rackley. That's Dave Archer. That's DJ Shockley. We are here for another week, and we are here because, fellas, we got a 53-man roster.
We made it, fellas. We made it.
We made
the team,
so
baby.
we've actually
we got a team.
We're here. We're not actually on the 53, but we're going to talk about the 53-man roster.
That's kind of how we celebrated when we did make it. We did.
Hey, sometimes that's kind of how it is in the locker room, especially if you're like guy 51, 52, 53. You're like, oh, yeah, okay, now let me just make it till the following Monday to where I get my first paycheck, and then it's like,
well,
okay.
You just hope one of those equipment guys don't walk through and go, damn, you're still here?
I thought you'd be gone by now. And then you have some words back with that guy.
Yeah.
So first of all, before we dive into the details, for those folks that have not watched us frequently over the last couple of years, we always come out in this show and we talk about this being the initial 53-man roster. So I'm going to let each of you guys give your own take on why we call this the initial 53-man roster. Shock?
I think you just said it when we first came in about obviously going from week to week. I think this is, to be honest, it starts as the initial 53 because you're just getting going and everybody makes the cut, but they might need to change it to like the ever-changing 53 because, as you mentioned,
feels like that, doesn't it?
Every single week you got to earn it. And what people don't understand is every single week of the season you have to, quote-unquote, make the 53. You have to make the 47 that's going to travel, and then there's times where, hey, maybe they find somebody else for your job. So let's be honest. This is an ever-changing 53 throughout the entire season because anything could happen at any single time. But initially, you say initial 53 because of you look around the league and everybody's doing the exact same thing. Everybody's cutting players. They're releasing guys. And this last 2 or 3 weeks, just like the Falcons scout staff, just like everybody else, they've been scouring the waiver wire for all the other guys on other teams. Maybe this guy could fit for us over here. Maybe this guy is a guy, if he gets cut, we bring him on. Maybe this is a guy they've been watching from afar. Or, hey, that guy really flashed when we went down in that joint practice with Miami. Maybe he's the guy that maybe we can bring on our squad. So there's always, after the first initial cuts, you look around the league and say, okay, does this guy fit better than maybe the guy we had at probably the bottom end of our roster? Could he be a guy that can come in right now and give us an even bigger advantage? So the initial part of it is, you got those guys who made the 53, but they're still always looking for other guys that can absolutely improve this roster. So it starts as, you're on it, but it's always changing.
Yeah, and when you think about it, we could have gotten together and there's about 7 guys that, wow, that dude probably should be on the team, could make the team. Remember, I had 65 for 53 last week, so I'm trying to pare it down. So Terry Fontenot and Raheem Morris are doing the same thing, and so they see there's 5 or 6 guys. It was really hard to let those guys go and keep guys in a different position. Well, now multiply that 31 more times.
Correct.
So now all of a sudden there's 5 or 6 guys in Carolina. There's 5 or 6 guys up in New York in 2 places. There's 5, So now all of a sudden that swells to like, all of a sudden there's 100 players out there, 90 players out there that might look good in an Atlanta Falcon uniform that maybe if you're in that back, like Shock was talking about, that back 6 or 8 guys, wait a minute, that guy might be a little bit better, especially, and great point by Shock, you went down and just participated with Miami. There might have been a couple of guys that jumped out at you that Miami didn't keep. You say, wait a minute, that dude locked us down. That guy got by us or something like that. So that's what's going on, and that's why it's the initial 53, and it's an ever-evolving thing. I think it's not for Bijan Robinson or for Tyler Algier or any of those guys, but for those guys that are in that 40 to 47 range, 40 to 50 range, it's an ever-evolving. And part of that has to do with injuries. If guys get hurt, you're all of a sudden now you got to reach and get a guy that might not be facilitated on a practice squad, and that's what's happening today, folks. Is they're building a practice squad of 16 players. You hope that's the pool of players they go get and not somebody from someplace else.
Think about this, guys, and for everybody that's watching and listening, is that most teams carried 90 in training camp. Is that correct? That's the
90.
number, right?
90.
And so to get down to 53, simple math says you got to get rid of 37 guys,
a lot of dudes.
right? So let's just call it outside the organization, 31 other teams that had to release 37 players. My quick math shows me that's 1,147 players are out there as available / looking for work.
Right.
So again, if you are kind of a casual fan, you would probably surmise that every NFL team has a college scouting department. What's their job? To go out and watch college players. Well, every NFL team has an NFL personnel department, and their job is to always have a sheet, okay, a depth chart, if you will, on the other NFL players around the league to know whether or not the dude in Miami that gave us fits would fit our roster, or you're taking the chance, as you mentioned, Arch, that these guys will still be available to sign to your practice squad. So even though they're not on the initial 53-man roster, many of them will get re-signed to the practice squad, and many of those guys will have a chance to get elevated to the active roster and actually play on Sundays or Mondays or Thursdays or whatever it ends up being. So that's the reason why we call it initial, for a number of different reasons. But this is going to be an evolving roster. And it's not always, guys, let's say they kept 9 offensive linemen. It's not always, well, an offensive lineman gets hurt, so we're going to go sign another offensive lineman. Well, not always, right? For a week, they might end up losing a lineman to injury, but then signing a linebacker. And then the next week, they might end up finding a lineman to put back on the active roster. So it's not always one for one. Cornerback gets hurt, you bring in another cornerback. If you're light at that position, if you need help there, yes, you bring in another one. But this roster, as we know it, this is what it stands as of, what's today? The 28th of August? This very well could be different by the 8th of September.
Yeah, and Terry Fontenot said something really interesting to us, Wes and I, on the pregame show before we kicked it off with Jacksonville in the preseason. We asked him about roster building and all the different intricacies, and it's a myriad of things that go into it. But he talked about, we're looking for the 48 guys, 48 active guys that can help us beat Pittsburgh. And so you talk about initial. Wait, that's just the first game, But so that's not Philly the next week. That's not Kansas City the next week. That's how maybe tenuous some of these jobs can be, like you're talking about, Rack, in the back end of the roster. Should somebody else become available? Should somebody get banged up? That's just the way it is, and that's why initial is the proper word.
And right now, Arch, that leads me to believe, and we all know this, but they've probably already watched a bunch of Pittsburgh film, and they might say, you know what, we need to have 9 offensive linemen, or we need this guy to play against that team because we feel like he is a great matchup for that team. And maybe he won't be next week, not to say that he's not on the active roster, but maybe this guy will play more against the Steelers and not as much in the next week, right? So this is a matchup league. This is a however we can beat the Pittsburgh Steelers and go 1-0 to start the season.
Yeah, and the other complication real quickly with that is I know a lot of people were really upset that the Falcons didn't play their regulars during training camp, or in the games. The other complication is if you get 4 or 5 guys banged up that are starters and or guys that are going to contribute, now all of a sudden it really jacks the numbers up as to who I'm keeping. I'm keeping a guy maybe for this week till I can get this guy healthy, but I've got to let a really good player go over here because I got to keep a guy because this guy's banged up. You see how complicated it can become.
Off script here, DJ. You brought me to a thought here, Dave. Off script. How many times have you guys either heard the question of preseason is hard to watch because they know we're affiliated with the team, or why do the starters not play? How many times have you guys gotten that question over the last few weeks, just since this season started?
Ad nauseum.
Yeah, I mean, it's come to my phone plenty of times where I just don't even respond now because it's gotten ridiculous with it. And I understand it. Fans want to see their star players. They want to see him out there. But you also want to see him out there week 1. You also want to see him going against the teams you're going to play best as well. And then you get later in the year, you're like, man, we had our third-string corner going against so-and-so, and you'd be like, okay, well, maybe if he was healthy during the beginning of the part of the year because he went through the preseason, he'd be here.
Yeah, but what are we going to hear?
Yeah.
What are we going to hear now?
Matter.
Okay, if you lose a guy, and inevitably guys are going to get banged up during the year. We hopefully God, is on our side and on the player side. We don't lose anybody during the season, but it's going to happen. Some guys are going to go down. Is it feasible to say it's more palpable? I can say that. For a guy to go down in the regular season as opposed to answering the questions we all inevitably got.
Yep.
Why is the guy playing? He got hurt in a meaningless game in the preseason.
Oh, no doubt. It's
So you can't have it both ways.
Yep.
So what Ra's done is he's got his regular guys ready for Pittsburgh. So all the guys he wants available for that game are going to be available for the Pittsburgh game because none of them got banged up in the preseason.
Absolutely, because you're right. It's easier to swallow when you say a guy get hurt during the regular season because he gets hurt in the preseason. The same person that asks you why the starters are not playing, they're going to say, well, why was he in the game anyway? It's freaking preseason.
Nothing.
That's it. Yeah. That's it.
All right, so now we know that the guys are on the roster. I'm coming to you, DJ, because let's go ahead and break this down a little bit. Let's talk about the offense because I got two quarterbacks with me. You don't have to talk about quarterback, but let me ask your initial impressions when you saw the initial 53-man as far as the offense is concerned.
I think the one thing that stuck out to me, obviously, was, Taylor Heineke being that third guy. That's a big conversation. We could probably talk about that for 30 minutes right here. But I think the other thing that stuck out to me was the Falcons' decision to keep 5 receivers. And it goes back to what Archie just mentioned about, you mentioned as well, Rick, about, okay, the numbers you may need for other positions, so you may lose out on one on the other side. And we talked about it the last couple of weeks, Chris Blair, and we've seen Casey Washington, two guys who in, preseason were two guys who were really making the most plays. Would they keep 6 receivers? And when it came out, okay, Chris Blair was not the guy. Casey Washington won that. You got 5 receivers, and you look around and say, okay, well, look on the other side of the ball, and you kept, 9 defensive backs. You kept, 9 D-line, whatever it may be. And for me initially, I was like, okay, you got 5 receivers in there, and that was a big top. You had 14 coming to camp.
Yeah.
Think about that. You got 14 receivers that came to camp fighting for a job, and at the end of the day, it was only 5 that made the roster. That just tells you how tough it is. And you look at the depth of this entire team and where they needed more. And you say, okay, well, they must feel really good about the 5 receivers they have going into the season, that you feel good about that. So I think that initially you saw, okay, wow, Chris Blair, I thought, played pretty good, gave you a lot to think about and say, this is a guy that could possibly be. This is a guy that, like we mentioned, Arch, this is a guy that maybe, hey, probably wanted him on his football team. But because of the way the numbers fell, you felt like, okay, we needed more guys at another spot. So I understand it. I was interested to see how that fell because coming in, you talked about 5 or 6 receivers. Usually you keep about 6 receivers. I was looking at another team around the league, and they kept 7 or 8 receivers. So it just depends on what your team needs. And the Falcons said, okay, we got 5 guys who we feel like we can go into week 1 and feel good about.
Yeah, I mean, DJ, you mentioned the quarterback situation, which I think it was a little intriguing because you have the veteran at Kirk Cousins as your starter, the rookie and Michael Penix as your backup, and you're thinking, do they need another seasoned veteran on this roster at the third quarterback position? As we've seen, some teams have just decided to go with 2 and they stash one on their practice squad. They decided not to, the Falcons, so they kept 3 on their active roster, which arguably takes away a receiver or a defensive back. What kind of stuck out to you when you looked at the offense, Arch?
Yeah, I think that the offensive line, we kept 9 offensive linemen, which is not unheard of to keeping 9 offensive line. Got to have those depth guys that can play multiple positions. Storm Norton will be the swing tackle. You've got Kyle Hinton who can play guard. Newsel can play guard and center. Jovan Gwynn played guard and center. So you kind of have a bunch of interior guys there. I kind of thought that there might be, and it still could be, initial roster. We get to that where whoever's on the float out there that might been one of those 3 or 4 players that could have made, the Commanders team or could have made Denver's team, and you had them rated pretty high, that's where it gets a little tenuous for guys like that at the back end.
Yep.
So is this the 9 offensive linemen that you're going to go into next week with, or are there a couple others? And certainly that's a possibility. The Chris Blair one was interesting. I think it gets down to when you begin to think about the roster and building a roster, talk about this, and this is Rack's area of expertise, was special teams. And I think Marquise Williams had some ideas as to who was the better player to put in special team situations. That's where a guy on the defensive side, I know you're going to get to that, so I don't blow that and blow the top off that until you want to get to it. But I think maybe Chris Blair and when you start Casey Washington battling. Casey Washington, was he a little bit better on special teams than Chris was? I don't know. And I think Chris, there's a good chance if they want to get him back here on the practice squad, because I think he certainly deserved, as Shock said, to make the team. But those are that was probably the only area. The Heineke thing, I think the Heineke thing, there's a lot of motives there. One, he can still play in this league. One, he's a veteran presence, as you talked about. And there are a number of teams that run a very similar style of offense that we run that might be in need of a guy at some point along the line. And is that forward thinking by Terry and his staff?
Get something for him?
I can get something for him. So that's all part of the mix too. We're moving stuff all over the board.
Yeah. Arch knows that, quarterbacks get injured around the league. And sometimes they always looking for a starter that's got some experience that's not playing right now. So, yes, it's interesting, though, that you guys did talk about Chris Blair. I'll make the one comment about special teams, and I don't know how it worked out here. Unless you're in the meeting rooms and you're on the practice field, you don't really know. But to your point, like maybe they realized that Casey Washington fits a little better maybe for all four or for 3 of the 4 kicking units, or maybe they just felt like Chris Blair needs a little bit more development. Like you said, they're hoping, as we record today, that they can get him on the practice squad, and then maybe he develops after a few more weeks, and then he is ready to get activated to the active roster. Yes, Mr. DJ.
I have a question.
Okay.
And this question goes to both of you guys. When you think about, sometimes we think about just receiver versus receiver. You bring up Marquise Williams. How much could it have he been the tiebreaker between an offensive coach and a defensive coach where we say, all right, we got Chris Blair versus a Natron Brooks? Could that be something that, that's a determining factor in which one of those guys make the ball club?
Yeah, I mean, my guess is it's very collaborative. My guess is not only Terry and the personnel staff, but all the coaches are sitting in there, and that's the one time, well, not the one time, but that's one of the times where your special teams coach has a very powerful voice.
He's a tiebreaker.
He's a very powerful voice to say, this kid right here, in my opinion, is going to help us either be more successful or is going to help us win more plays on special teams. Again, right now, from what I've seen through 3 games of preseason, this is the guy that I want to go to battle with on game 1.
Gotcha.
We know that this stuff can change, but Arch, would you agree? That special teams coordinator has got a lot of say at the end of picking this 53-man roster.
I think it's just confirmation, guys, of something we've talked about when you go to camp is you're constantly being evaluated, whether you're in the cafeteria, whether you're in the meeting rooms with the special teams, whether you're in your position coach's meeting room, team meeting room, you're out on the field and you're interacting with your teammates. All that chemistry that you're trying to build as a team, yes, you want guys that can play. All these guys can play that are out here. But where's that chemistry, that mix and stuff? And sometimes it boils down to maybe that dude's really good in the locker room, and that's part of what we need from our culture. You hear teams and players, it's overused, but the idea of culture, that's part of it as well. And so that when you get down to the nth degree, when you've got your special teams coach that maybe is the tiebreaker between the two, that might be part of the mix that goes into it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the crazy / scary part, is that there might just be one trait. Like this, he might be like, you know what? This dude asked me a lot of really thought-provoking questions out on the practice field. That's the mind that I want, right? And that everything else could have been equal. And one guy could have just asked more questions.
How he came to that meeting in special teams, did he come there with the same vigor he came in as a wide receiver or a DB room? And did he work as hard in the special teams piece of practice as he did when he was with his position group? I mean, there's so many things that are being evaluated. That's why practice, I know everybody concentrates on the preseason games, and I understand that. But that's why practice has such a wealth of information and so much weight in decision-making and getting into the initial 53.
Yeah, so that's kind of a good synopsis on the offensive side of the ball. DJ, let's flip over to the defense, because I feel like you both have got some very interesting points that you want to make as far as the guys that we initially saw on the defensive side.
I think I'll go straight to the secondary. Obviously, a guy that I know we all were high on. We talked about multiple times, and Kevin King, a guy who we thought coming off being out of the league for 2 years, being injured. We heard his story. He had a pick in the first game. We saw him in the last game playing safety. So you talk about, okay, this guy's got versatility. This guy can be one of those guys who, like Archie talked about, the offensive line can play multiple positions that can help you. And when he didn't make the ball club, that was kind of shocking because I thought he was a guy that you saw enough of in preseason. You saw enough of him in camp. We talked about him in nauseum that what was the difference maker between him and, Antonio Hamilton Sr., a guy who is in a similar vein, can do multiple things as well. But you thought, to be honest, I thought he was on the team. I thought he made the ball club. Yeah. And I thought he did enough to be a part of it. But as we know, there's other factors that go into it that we don't know what goes on in these meeting rooms or goes on between the staff when they break down what they need, especially in the secondary. So not to have Kevin King on this team I thought was interesting. And, we probably won't ever get an answer to it. Maybe Arch can. He can get the inside for us. But I thought he definitely was a guy that was deserving of being on this ball club. At the end of the day, Raw and Jimmy Lake, they thought that, hey, we got another guy who could fill that void, and maybe he's a guy you bring back. Maybe he's a guy that you find room for him, and you never know what can happen, and before you know it, he's on the team in week 2, and he's a part of this equation. So,
or DJ, do I go back to our initial conversation and say maybe he did enough for 31 other teams that they said this kid was a good player coming out. He was a good player his first couple of years, battled some injuries. Yeah. But I saw a couple things in the preseason from him. Yeah. We're going to take a chance on him, right? So maybe he did enough not for this organization, but maybe for one of the other 31 teams.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Rack. I think that's definitely a possibility. I think it's probably more of a probability, right? I've got Locke. I put on my roster as I was trying to build it last week. I put locks. I put stars next to locks. If you notice that name right there, King has a lock next to it.
Got a star there.
I was the same way you were because of the versatility and what he could do. I had Hamilton as a lock because of his ability to play some safety too. Micah Abernathy ends up in. So you go back and you start thinking about, okay, guys that play multiple spots. You forget about special teams. Micah Abernathy is a core special teams guy.
Yep,
he's a gunner. He's on different spots. And so that might have outweighed what versatility of a guy playing a couple positions in the secondary way. And then you also have, and this is the part that I think that maybe people are missing, is the ability for Simmons, the safety, and by the way, so I watched a little bit of practice. Those two guys in the back end with Simmons and Bates got the hair standing up on the back of the neck.
Love it.
But Justin Simmons and Jesse Bates' ability to rock down and cover, all of a sudden, we forgot about their versatility about, they're the safety, so we kind of take them out of the mix. No, their ability to do that probably made some of these guys that were depth guys, like maybe a Kevin King, expendable a little bit because, wait a minute, I've got guys that can do that I've already got on this team that are going to be part of my core guys.
You guys remember the conversation we had last week, and we were talking a little bit about this, and you mentioned Micah Abernathy, and I said, make it to where the coach says that he can't afford to not have you on the roster.
No doubt.
That's it.
That was probably the case with Mike Abernathy.
I agree.
No doubt.
Say what you want about defense, and he's going to help us out there. But I'm betting it was Williams saying, Coach, this kid right here is a staple of our special teams. He has got to be on the roster. And if it's like that, it probably wasn't even a question in the first place, right? Think about Matthew Slater from the Patriots, right? He got a roster spot every year because he was arguably the best special teams player in the league because he was that good. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that Abernathy's in that conversation, but you got to get to the point to where they say, you are a lock. This kid is that important to the roster. How about, let me just throw out two other names to you. J.D. Bertrand. What'd you guys see in the preseason? And granted, when you're drafted on the higher end of the draft, okay, I'm saying when you're not 6 or 7, or obviously undrafted free agent, you got a better chance of making the team. But he makes it as one of the 4, call it inside linebackers. Did you guys like what you saw from him early on?
I was a big fan of JD. Obviously, everything he brought coming to this organization before he got here was a big part of why they went on and got him. And you look at the way he plays, the way he carries himself, he's in the same mode of Caden Ellis. He's the same mode of Trey Anderson. He's in the same mode of Nate Lamming. I mean, they have 4 clones, I think, at that inside linebacker spot. Guys who are hunting, guys who absolutely love football, and guys who are leaders. And J.D. fit that. And you saw that throughout preseason. You saw him in camp. Rock called them the leaders of the rookies. I mean, you can see the excitement he had when he drafted him, when you talked to him, 2-time captain in Notre Dame. He was telling me a story how the University of Georgia actually recruited him and took their scholarship away, said he wasn't good enough to play there. And you think for a lot of kids, that would destroy him. Mm-hmm. He just goes on to be a 2-time captain and, most tackles, all this kind of stuff. Now he's back in the state of Georgia where he grew up playing. Just a great story, but even better football player, I think, about J.D., and I think he's going to fit really great in that room.
Guess what? You can eat crow. I'm good enough not only to play in this state, but I'm good enough to play as a professional.
Absolutely.
And I made the active roster.
Exactly.
Let me just throw out a couple more names and see if anything sparks a conversation. Zion Logue, LaCale London. Any surprises with either of those guys?
The defensive line, and I think we could all argue, was the deepest room on the team, right? Yeah. Short of those linebackers, I think we had a pretty good idea who the 4 linebackers were going to make this team. You just mentioned Bertrand. He was going to be that 4th guy to go with Ellis and Nate Landman and Anderson. So you kind of had that. But the D-line loaded. I mean, you drafted in the D-line, and then you added some free agents a year ago that were still part of this roster, like Contavious Street, who really had a really good camp. And now all of a sudden, wow, there's just not enough room for everybody. And I thought that 9 was heavy.
Right.
Because they kept 9. Usually that's kind of, you're probably playing when you start talking. Now, James Smith-Williams checks in as a D lineman. I had him kind of an edge guy, but he is going to play kind of the heavier edge, so one of the 3 down linemen in the D line. But you're playing 3 down linemen. If you're counting that edge guy like James Smith-Williams, you got 9 of those guys. Normally, you're probably talking maybe 7, something like that. So that just tells you how good and how deep that position is.
I think it makes another point to the emphasis and importance that this staff has put on the trenches. We just talked about keeping 9 offensive linemen. Now you got 9 defensive linemen. Having that depth in this league, we know is tremendous. Yeah, you can have all the skill positions you want, but we have been here and seen over the years where that hasn't been the strong suit. And even with the Julio Joneses on the outside and Matt Ryan back there, we saw him get hit the most ever by a quarterback one year and, still find a way to do it. But understanding that in the trenches is where you can win ball games, because it's going to be ball games where you need to run the football. It's going to be ball games where you need to stop the run. It's going to be ball games you need to get after the quarterback. You can have all the skill guys you want, and as skilled guys is all we are. It's hard to say it, but you understand the importance of those guys. So like Arch mentioned, to look at that group when, 2 weeks ago when you're like, man, I don't know how they're going to cut this down. You got so many dudes. I mean, big props to Eddie Goldman, a guy who was in and out, left the game, came back, rejuvenated. Now he's on the ball club. I mean, there's so many other guys that fit into the equation, and it just made it hard. And like I said, this is – Ross said it, after the last game. This is the toughest part of the year for coaches, for staff, to make these hard decisions, because at the end of the day, we talked about there's 90 guys that come to camp. Those 90 guys were picked by this staff. So obviously you felt like those guys would fit what you want. So to get rid of those guys, absolutely, that makes it tough. So you go through this process, and this makes it hard.
That's the amazing part about this. I think that we forget about is human beings are playing the game. It's not robots out there and stuff, and they got families and they've got all this kind of stuff. So you got 90 guys who are trying to make it, and we understand when we come here that there's going to be. It's a battle of attrition. You've got to try to survive and advance, right? To coin Jim Valvano, the great Jim Valvano. So you got to survive and advance here. But I was at practice today. You went from 90 to 53, and I don't know how you guys remember this, but I remember when we walked out for that first practice.
Weird.
Where is everybody? What happened?
Yeah.
We don't have enough guys to play. You start looking around. There's like 3 guys over there. There's like 5 guys over there, and it was weird. It was a weird feeling, and you felt you felt grateful because you survived. You felt proud that you'd survived, but you kind of felt for those guys. So the emotions, not only as the players and your teammates, but also, Terry Fontenot and just like Shock talked about, they went and picked these guys to bring him in and get them signed and get them in here. And so there's an investment emotionally over the last 3 months with these guys, getting them ready to play, learning the system, spending time with them and their families and all that kind of stuff. So very difficult proposition, just that piece of it, to try to trim these guys out in very difficult conversations when you got to cut a guy loose. His dream of playing in this league may be gone, or he's going to have to go find someplace else to do it.
Initially shattered, and you hope that he picks up the pieces or ends up landing on somebody else's roster. Go ahead.
And one last thing to that point, Taylor Heineke talked to you after the game about that, Arch. A guy who, going into his 10th year, said, you know what, man, I really want to be on this football team.
Yeah.
And mentioned how he could feel the change and how this was probably one of the best rosters he's ever been a part of. And how he felt so good about what Ra was doing already in year one as the head coach. That's hard, man. A lot of guys who, like you said, you've been around here since last season started, going through OTAs, mini camps, working out, getting to know your teammates in here, putting the time in. And then it comes down to, 2 or 3 weeks that, you got a chance to be on this team. So it's tough.
That's right.
Family says you're not invited to the barbecue.
For real.
We don't have a hamburger for you. You're gone.
Guys, I was asking you those questions about preseason and how many people ask you about, like, oh, why are they playing this? You know what the great thing is? Nobody's going to ask you those questions anymore. They don't care now. They don't care. Because you know what?
Come on.
The regular season starts a week from this coming Sunday. September 8th, Falcons are at home against the Pittsburgh Steelers at 1 p.m. Mercedes-Benz Stadium. We'll be back one more time before then. We're gonna get into some game plan stuff before they take the field for the regular
Pittsburgh.
season. But, hey, thank y'all so much for joining us as we break down the initial 53-man roster. And you know what that means. That regular season is right around the corner, and we are about to play some meaningful games that count. And you know what your goal is for the first week? 1-0. That's it. On behalf of Shot, Arch, I'm Rack. Continue to like, subscribe, review on Spotify, iTunes, AtlantaFalcons.com, and YouTube. And we appreciate you watching us here on the Falcons Audible, presented by AT&T. Take care, everybody.